So welcome to Baking the Perfect Site, a non-chef's guide to Drupal recipes. I cannot cook, so do not expect any meaningful recipes out of me, unless it has to do with Drupal in a way. Drupal I can do more or less. A big thank you to the sponsors for making the Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit happen. It's been 5 years, I believe, which is a long, long time. So it's pretty exciting to be amongst you again. The Wannabe Chef, that's me. I'm Pavlos. Been doing Drupal about 14 years. You can find me on all the usual socials, pretty much the same username. The sous chef on the corner is Donnie, and he's more or less the reason I cannot stay tonight. So blame him.
Donnie, you wanted to party.
I'm a lead technical architect at Acquia. That's until December 31st. So if any of you is hiring, let me know. So what are we going to go through today? We're going to first take a look at what Drupal recipes are. How are they different from install profiles? And what are their use cases? Why do we think Drupal recipes will be the future? We're going to take a look at the current state of affairs, see what we have to play with right now, and we'll take a look at what's coming down the road. We'll also take a look at what we can do with recipes and, more importantly, what we cannot do, what's discouraged, let's say. If we have time at the end, we're going to go through and look at some code, dive into what exactly makes a Drupal recipe, and see if we can create a pretty simple first recipe. So what are Drupal recipes? It's basically a repeatable way to quickly add configuration to a Drupal application. Think of Drupal 7 features back in the day, but a lot more geared towards the specific functionality of adding configuration versus having a full-fledged module, let's say. They can install modules for us to provide any extra functionality we may not have in our system right now. They can be built on other recipes, and in some ways this is strongly encouraged because Drupal already ships with a lot of granular out-of-the-box recipes of its own. Like, let's say if we take the standard profile, for example, that usually ships with a basic page, an article, I believe, and I think those are the two content types standard ships with. So those pretty much can be found in recipes now as of 10.3. So if you wanted to extend and build your own article recipe, it would be strongly encouraged to use to create a recipe that uses the core node article recipe and extend it to fit your needs. That way, everyone more or less starts from the same base and we can all use the same things. Another example is, let's say we had an event management system that could be comprised by a recipe that gives us the event content type itself. We're going to take a look at one such recipe a bit later. And then that could also wrap a recipe that gives us a calendar, a recipe for a registration system, and so on. And building recipe by recipe, we can more or less put together a full-fledged feature or even a system. The main goal of recipes, I guess, if goal is the right word, would be that they are easy to share. So I can grab my recipe, I can pass it on to you, you can apply it to your website, and it will just work, or at least that's the aim of it. It's not like, we're going to touch on it a bit later, but it's not like install profiles, let's say, where it's one and done. I cannot necessarily get my install profile and pass it to Erin to use it on her own existing application. Whereas with the recipe, you can apply it more or less wherever you want, as long as there's no configuration conflicts. So another thing to know about recipes is that they are applied, they are not installed, and they can be applied at any stage during the project's life cycle. So let's say I have a project that went live a few months ago, and the client comes to me and says, I need this new feature, like the event system, and because the application right now doesn't have events, because there wasn't a need for it. If I have my events recipe ready to go, I can just apply it on the system immediately, and that will give me a full-fledged feature ready to go. And if I need any extra minor customizations here and there, I can go ahead and do those. The other thing, unlike install profiles and distributions, multiple recipes can be applied on the same project, especially since recipes can be comprised by other recipes. And then we reach, okay, we're talking about recipes, they're great, but why do we need them? Why can't we just keep using install profiles and distributions? The main issues with the existing systems that we have available is that they're difficult to keep up to date. More importantly, for me at least, they're more difficult to share, because usually an install profile and a distribution is built for a very bespoke purpose. So let's say if I have a customer that needs to roll out a bunch of product sites, I'll build an install profile that keeps building the same site over and over, but I cannot then share it with another customer because that's built for that customer specifically. And more importantly, I cannot just get a single feature and use it on any of my other projects. Whereas with recipes, since we are more or less keeping them as granular as possible and as containerized as possible, I can just lift my events recipe and apply it to any project that needs an events content type or a calendar and so on. Like we already said, it cannot be mixed and matched with other profiles. And also, install profiles, I think Drupal very recently made them uninstallable, but they are not that easy to remove either. If anyone tried removing Lightning back in the day before Lightning came up with its own uninstaller, you would know. So who are they for? Generally speaking, they are for site builders that want an easy way to get started with their Drupal project. So we as developers, we would create our recipe, put it ideally on Drupal.org so everyone can find it there, and people can start, if they find the value in it, they can start using it immediately. In my opinion, recipes provide a great pre-configured starting point. So you are not limited to what the recipe gives you. Think of it like a starter kit. You take it and you make it your own. So just because the article recipe shipped with single taxonomy called tags, let's say, there's nothing stopping us from adding a new category taxonomy to the article content type and mulling it into whatever our customer needs. The other neat thing about it is that we can use the recipe again and again over multiple sites. So they are also great for those people that manage things like a platform of sites, let's say, like universities, where all of the departments more or less follow a template, let's say, and they may or may not have the same features, but if they need a certain feature, we can just apply the recipe to it and they're good to go. And we don't have to apply the recipe from the start, which, depending on how well versed the department's users, maybe they might get overwhelmed with unnecessary information. So we can have a bespoke site just for them with some very common recipes that everyone uses, and when the time comes to add a new recipe for a new feature, we can apply it then, and they're good to go.
Can we improve a feature? Like if you have the news recipe, can you add the new version of it? You get
They are
really.
not upgradable.
Right.
So you can reapply the recipe, but it doesn't guarantee an upgrade path. Because, like, going back to the point from earlier, they're basically meant to be a starter kit, a starting point, basically. Once you apply it, it's yours, you own it, basically. So if we're also building for different audiences, but the key feature is the same, we can still apply the same recipe and just make it our own.
Okay.
We have the example of Company Z that has many product websites that's providing news tutorials, blog posts, etc. Some of their departments or some of their brands may not have a pretty big team behind it, so we don't want to overwhelm them with the entire feature set of our platform out of the gate. So by holding back these features, we can slowly introduce features to a site as needed, and the users are less overwhelmed for it as well. So what's currently out of the oven? Where are we right now? As of right now, phase 1 is basically complete. There is an experimental module that made it into 10.3 and 11.x. That basically gives us 4 new APIs in Drupal core, our config actions, which is config actions is what recipes use to act on a piece of configuration. So you could say things like, if this content type exists, or if this config exists, then configure it like so. There's a checkpoint API. What that basically means is that when we are applying a recipe, Drupal takes a snapshot, let's say, for lack of a better word, and tries to apply the recipe. If, for whatever reason, that application fails, Drupal will roll back to the snapshot, the checkpoint, and it will be as if nothing happened. We have default content, so a recipe can also install default content for us if we wanted to. So let's say we had a very complicated content type and we wanted to give some examples to our users on how to use it. We could roll out some default content for them. I believe under the hood we use the default content contrib module to export the content, and then core will import it if it's available. And last but not least, of course, there's the recipe class that wraps everything else together. The recipe API depends on the other three, but the other three are independent of each other. And again, the great thing about recipes, and you'll hear me repeat it over and over, is that they can be applied at any point. We don't have to apply it at the beginning of the project. We don't have to install a Drupal site using a profile. We can just start as simple as possible and keep adding as we go on. What's coming up? So phase one is complete. We have a semblance of recipes in core. What's the initiative doing now? Right now they're working on a UI for applying recipes. So we're going to see a bit later that the only way right now to apply recipes is through the command line using a command provided by Drupal. So ideally we would want a UI for this, since we're aiming this system to be for site builders. They should be discoverable in project browser. So when you go spin up Starshot, whenever Starshot comes, you should be able to see an array of recipes that you can choose from to install. Some of those are already in the works, like the events recipe. I'm working on the multilingual recipe, so if after this you feel like you want to collaborate, feel free to reach out. They are improving on how these recipes get applied to the project. So instead of keep reapplying the recipe, they will be trying to merge the config updates in instead. And also they're adding support for resetting the configuration to the original recipe. So let's say you installed the recipe, you had your article content type, and you made some changes to it. Now you are regretting those changes, you want to go back to where you were. You should be able, once that feature runs, you should be able to reset it back to its existing original configuration. And last but not least, the multi-site support for the Drupal recipes command, because right now it only acts on the default site. But since we use multi-sites extensively, especially for platforms, we want that supported. We will have improved config actions. For example, right now there's not necessarily an action that allows us to create views or edit views. So that should be coming in soon. Automated testing for recipes, because we want whatever it is that we are building to be testable. We want to prove that this recipe does indeed provide the article content type with these specific fields that we are calling out in our recipe description. So we want them to be testable. Validation for recipes and the configuration that they are installing, I believe that's already done. They should be able to get user input when you're applying a recipe. For example, when you are installing the multilingual recipe on Starshot, you should be able to select the languages that you want to install on your site. And yeah, that's landed in 10.4, so it should be with us soon. They're working on converting the rest of the profiles into recipes, like umami and minimal. And also there's many more features that are in the works. Yeah. Let's see, what did I open? Yeah, you'll see the roadmap in here. A lot of stuff landed and a lot more stuff coming up. So it's a pretty heavy initiative. If you have any time and want to contribute, it's a great initiative to dive in. So what can a recipe do? Right now, it can provide a list of other recipes to apply to our site. So we already talked about the events example that depends on other event recipes. It can provide a list of other projects to install via Composer. So a recipe like a module is comprised of a Composer file with all of its dependencies, any modules that recipe needs in order to work, and any other extra packages. And because of that, we are encouraging people to add their recipes on Drupal.org so that they are easily discoverable. The nice thing, since all of this is done by a Composer, is like modules, we can have our own private recipes, let's say. So if your organization is building your own bespoke feature set, let's say, you could host your recipes in your GitHub repos and then add the repository to your root Composer file and start requiring your recipes from there. Pretty much exactly how modules and themes work right now. They provide a list of modules to install, a list of themes if we wanted a recipe for the theme. They provide configuration, so we can add new configuration, we can update existing configuration. We can provide content, like default content, like we said, but we can also provide suggestions on other recipes that may complement the recipe that we just installed. So if, for example, the events recipe that we applied was the standalone, that events recipe could have a suggestion to, hey, I noticed you installed the events recipe, you may consider a calendar to go with it or a registration system to go with it. So it's an easy way to make people aware of other complementary recipes to what we built. So what can a recipe not do? A recipe shouldn't provide functionality. For example, we should not be, shouldn't, it's kind of a wrong word because we're not able to anyway. A recipe doesn't provide any functionality such as hooks, services, any code to go with it. If you do need code and functionality, it's better to wrap that in its own custom module that the recipe then requires. They do not provide upgrade paths. Think of them as a starting point or a starter kit for a particular feature, and they are not part of a deployment. So if we have a CI/CD workflow going on, we cannot tell it part of this pipeline install this recipe. A recipe just gets applied as any other module. It applies its configuration, it makes its changes, and then it's up to us to export that configuration as we do currently with our current systems, commit it and deploy it. And also recipes cannot remove configuration. If we allow recipes to remove configuration, it would have made it a lot harder for recipes to work with each other. So think of them as being additive. Okay, so that's pretty much it for an overview of what recipes are. Before we dive into any code, did anyone have any questions so far? No. Okay.
I actually do. I'm just thinking through something, but I guess I was going to ask about how you apply them, and I see that you have some scripts there. And then the other question, I guess, I was thinking like there are ways to provide like there are like variables that like what does a recipe look like? Is it like a YAML file? Is it
Yeah, so at its very core, it's a YAML file, yes. The only real required file for a recipe is the recipe.yaml, basically. They usually get discovered by Drupal, at least right now, in the root of the Drupal project /recipes. That's where Composer puts them. They're usually like modules. They have a specific name. The YAML file itself, it's right now at least always called recipe.yaml. Let's go see that actually. That's a bit small, I guess. What do I zoom in?
It's under appearance. Yeah, view appearance.
Okay, thank you.
The presentation mode.
So at its very core, a recipe is just that recipe YAML file, basically. Everything else that we're gonna see is optional. The only required thing is the recipe YAML file. Right now, this recipe, I was just toying around with the system, so I created it manually. That's why there's no composer file. But if it was a recipe that was coming from Drupal.org, for example, let's bring in the events recipe. And you'll see it's exactly like we're requiring a module or any other Drupal package. So yeah, see, right now we have the events recipe. And generally speaking, because you would normally require the recipes through Composer, the recipes directory itself is treated like you treat the module's contrib directory, basically ignore it.
I think the reason that I'm asking, and this is just kind of an example of something that I'm looking to get out of recipes, or just how I would use recipes to do this, is something that I do often is I'll have a content type, right, and then I'll have a vocabulary that's associated with that content type. That's like, we'll take event, for example. You have an event, and then I'll have an event type vocabulary.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I would really like is to be able to just like easily create any content type basically that has an associated type, content type name type vocabulary associated.
Not too sure that's something that you'll be able to do with recipes.
Okay, that's fair.
That sounds more like a specific functionality.
Sure.
And at least the current recipe system is not built for like
Well, they made the body field a recipe.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be like part of the code in Node. So it's sort of similar to that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if this is a thing, then do your logic on that thing.
Yeah, so if the thing exists, do something, basically. And if we take a look at core, we can see all the recipes that core ships with, like for example, the vocabulary for the article content type is its own recipe. And then there's a recipe for the actual content type, a recipe for configuring the comments and so on, and then everything sort of wraps together to create the standard profile.
Would it be an appropriate use for recipes if you had two sites and you wanted to like share a menu with menu links between them to, like, I noticed the config directory in there. I'm assuming those are the YAML files you export from. Okay, so, and then you'd have to create the menu content items. Anyway, is that an appropriate use for it? So then you install the recipe here and then you have that same top level menu in 4 or 5 different Drupal sites? Or is that
The moment
misunderstanding?
you install it, it will diverge, because the content that the recipe will provide will just apply for that particular moment.
Meaning
when
the
you
IDs
install
would
it.
change on the content, or like what if I wanted to
Meaning there's nothing stopping me as the user from coming and adding another.
Right. Okay. No, I get that. That's okay. But like as a starting point, rather than have to, because I guess the other way to do it would be you export those config files and then import them there.
Mhm.
But I'm just wondering if this is another way to like group your chunks of config that you might want to share.
Yeah, it's a way to do that, but it's not a way, let's say, to
Be able to change
keep
all
them
in sync.
keep them in sync
Uh-huh.
forever,
Yeah. Okay.
because the recipe just gets applied and then it's
That
done.
makes sense. Okay.
So following on that question, he would probably use default content to take that
Mhm.
that navigation. Is default content revertible?
As far as I'm aware, no.
Because you said you can revert recipes.
Yeah.
But not the content that you bring?
I haven't checked that. I'm just going by what I know about the default content module itself.
Sorry, that's
I mean, if they built the functionality so that when you uninstall the recipe, it deletes the content as well, then in a sense, yeah.
I guess deleting it would be reverting.
Well, and the version's still in progress, right? That's not
Yeah.
good.
So,
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So, I've worked with config split before.
Yeah.
So, are you familiar with config split?
Mhm.
Okay, so other than default content, what would you say is unique about recipes to versus
The
config split? Because I'm
config.
hearing, installing modules and installing config and
Mhm.
that sort of thing. It sounds very similar.
So, with recipes, config splits always kind of apply the same configuration whenever we run the import, at least the way I use them usually. So, recipes, though, once you install them, you don't reinstall the configuration. So it's done. Once you install it, it's more or less done. You export it, commit it in code, and deploy. The other thing that recipes give us is config actions, which allows us to take certain actions, for lack of a better word, depending on what's happening on our application. So if I bring up the docs for a moment, we can go see the list of actions that we currently have. And there are actions that can be taken on all of the configuration entities, like create if not exist. Actually, I don't know why I would ever use create when I have create if not exist. Disable, enable, set third-party settings if we are acting on a content type or any other config entity. I guess there's certain actions that can only be taken on specific config entities, like adding a field to a bundle. Well, that can only be done if we're on the field storage content entity, config entity, sorry, granting permissions. Those can only be done on roles and so on. So they are a bit more powerful than config split, where config split would offer us a way to install the same configuration repeatedly every time. With config actions, we can do things like only take this action, only apply this configuration if this specific condition exists. So those are some of those are the current config actions we have. We do have wildcards, which would allow us to do things like add the same permission to all user roles, let's say. I'm wondering if this may be something that you could use for your use case. I haven't played a lot with wildcards, so need to take that back and come up with a nice example for them. The one that I'm specifically waiting for is the ability to prompt the user for input. So you can say, I'm installing the article content type, the article recipe. Sorry, I'm applying the article recipe. But the user or the site builder may not necessarily want the content type to be named article. You could present them with a prompt that says, okay, what do you want to name this content type? The machine name, I don't think would be changeable, but you could change things like the label or other things like that. Or if we're talking multilingual, or you could add the language. If you are installing the Drupal's contact form, I believe that requires email address, so you could present an input to the user to provide the email address that will be used for the contact form. Actually, you could do the same for web when you're configuring web forms. If you have a recipe that provides web forms. But generally speaking, one of the reasons that I didn't have more slides was because I wanted to show you the docs. Basically, the team did a pretty good and extensive job in documenting everything. And this is in the distributions recipes project. So if I'll share the slides, I believe everyone should have the slides afterwards. So you could go here and look at all of the various features, config actions, the roadmaps that the recipe could provide. Another cool thing about recipes that we should mention is that, like, they can be split into recipe types, where we could have a recipe type for site, I believe, or a content type if we're providing a content type recipe. And then we can also have recipes that take over the entire site, which is like a site recipe. So keep that in mind as well. So all our recipes can be more or less categorized depending on what they do, and we are encouraged to keep them as granular as possible so we can keep using the same building blocks to build more complex recipes. So if I have the taxonomy vocabulary that we were talking about earlier, there's no point redefining that vocabulary and keep adding that same config in all of the recipes that we may be curating. If we just split it out into its own recipe, and any other recipe that requires that vocabulary can include it. So we're sharing is caring, basically.
Huh.
And going back to the recipes YAML file that we were looking at earlier, like we said, this is the only required file that we have. A recipe comes with a name, its description, the type of recipe it is. For this one, it's content type, since we were basically creating the article content type. If it depends on other recipes, like for example, if we were using the core node article recipe, we could include it here. So this recipe would apply cores, and then on top of it do all of our customizations. It can install modules. Now the thing to know when we're installing modules is that only simple configuration gets installed. Things like config entities that may be shipping with those modules would not be getting installed unless explicitly asked in the config import key. So for example, here we're installing all the config entities that are coming with the path auto module. If we were installing, let's say, the content moderation module, if we didn't specify content moderation here, we would not get the default workflow that ships with content moderation. It would be up to us to go and create the workflow manually. So it gives you pretty much a lot of power and control over what you install and what gets installed and what doesn't get installed. And once we have all of that done, we go into our config actions, which is where we say if an editor role doesn't exist, go and create it, and then grant these permissions. So since the standard profile already ships with an editor role, it ships with an article, so the example is a bit bad. Apologies for that. But if it didn't have the article and we were installing it through a recipe, we could tell it go add these permissions to the role. And if it doesn't exist, create it. Similarly, if we don't, I think by default the article content type also gets added to the main navigation menu for some reason. So if we wanted to prevent that, we could provide the menu UI's third-party settings through here so that we disable that configuration. And last but not least, the default content that would go. So earlier I did require the events recipe, I believe, yeah. So let's go log into our site. So right now you'll see I don't have any sort of events content type here. Just for clarity, this is the recipe that we are applying. So it's Martin's recipe that he's working for Starshot, which would be providing an events calendar, the events content type, and so on. Those are other recipes that are suggested. Sorry. So this is the recipe we want to apply. So let's go ahead and apply it. I am in ddev, so I have a. Let's take a look at that. Have a ddev command that will go away and run the Drupal command for us. But basically, every time we apply a recipe, we apply it by running this command, and at the end we would have the keyword recipe and then the name of the recipe. So if I go ahead and do ddev Drupal recipe events, this applied path events is not a directory. Let's check out that recipe that we heard. Event. When in doubt, clear the cache. Do I need the nope. Okay, let's see what the docs say. Recipes, yes. Yes. No. Was it recipes you said?
Recipes/events.
Yeah.
It's plural recipes.
Great, thank you. We got there. So,
Do we know why? Crowdsource syntax.
yeah, would be interesting. The syntax is because you're requiring Drupal/events, but when you are applying the recipe, you are applying recipes/events. It's a bit confusing. That's why we need the UI for the site builders, so they don't have to deal with stuff like this. So let's clear our cache. Let's go back to our site. Now we have our event content type. It comes with its own body and a smart date field. Everything is more or less pre-configured, and I can start adding my events.
It's like
And that's like that. We have our event. It's all pre-configured. Even the display is pre-configured, so it gives you the links to add it to your Outlook, to your Apple Calendar, your Google Calendar. So you have a pretty much ready to go feature that you can make your own.
Awesome.
so fast.
And basically that's it. Yeah, that's what I heard about recipes. It's a really powerful system. I highly recommend going through the docs. I keep discovering something new every time I go through it. So yeah, and if you want to collaborate on RP, leading the multilingual recipe for Start Shop, so feel free to hit me up on the Drupal Slack and we can work together.
Right.
Before we wrap up, any other questions?
Where was the docs?
Yeah.
Oh, right there.
It's under Git Drupal code.
Recipes.
try it. And it's gonna be in the slides. I'll add it to the slides so that everyone can. You don't have to go searching for it.
I have a question.
Yep.
Wondering about like what you see with compatibility between recipes. Like, are people kind of creating stuff in the dark, and then when you throw it onto your site, do they end up with like collisions?
There could be conflicts. So if a recipe, let's say for example, if it always tries to create a particular configuration instead of using the create if not exist config action, then you could run into conflicts because that recipe would always try to create a content type that already exists, and Drupal would not like that. So there are potential for conflicts. That's why they've put a lot of, as many safeguards as they could basically around them to minimize such things, but it's always possible.
How do they fail?
Let's
Like if there is a conflict on one of the configs, does the rest go through or does the whole thing stop?
the whole recipe will stop. So nothing from the recipe will be applied. It will take the snapshot when you run the command, try to apply the recipe, and if it fails, it will roll the config back to what it was before the recipe got applied. So no config from the failed recipe would be on your site afterwards. Let's try adding that article recipe, see if it will fail. Yeah. So because I'm trying to add something that already exists, and it also doesn't match what's been installed by standard. I believe they're trying to mitigate as well, because right now if the keys in the YAML file are different from what's stored in the database, you may run into this issue as well. So there's an issue on Drupal.org where they're trying to resolve that. That's something to be mindful of. But yeah, since this basically failed and my recipe also had a change in it to disable the menu, it should not, yeah, it didn't apply. So this, if the recipe applied, this would have been disabled. Because in the recipe itself, we were telling it to not add any available menus to this content type.
Do recipes, can they be bundled with like components or specific things that show up in the theme, or is it all just
They can install the theme.
Yeah.
I haven't looked into single directory components a lot, but that's a good question. I should take a look at it. How do you usually include
I don't
components
know.
right
It's not mine.
Maybe like in a custom module,
Yeah.
so just kind of being a bundle together.
Okay, so if it's in a custom module, then you would probably just require that custom module in your recipe, and then it would be getting enabled. And then the recipe can also enable a theme for you, so as long as you add it to the recipe, you should be good to go. So another thing for recipes is that you can, like the same way we provide config in a module's config installed directory, you can provide config that will always get installed in a recipe. Otherwise, you can also create set config using config actions. So if you know you're always going to be using the entire YAML file, might as well provide it in the config directory for the recipe to use. Otherwise, if you want to do more granular changes to the configuration and retain even more control, like for example, using the create if not exist config action, you would be better off using config actions. And so that's a good reason to keep your recipes compact and bare bones, because if you keep adding config actions for every single thing in one recipe, you will end up with a pretty huge and unmanageable or very hard to maintain recipes YAML file. So break them apart as much as possible.
Have you, I mean, recipes are still really new in the grand scheme. Have you used them for,
I have not used them for a client project yet. I do think in terms of they would be very useful for multi-sites and factory settings, platform settings, basically. Or let's say if I had an agency, let's say, and I curated my own bespoke feature set that I always give to my customers because I believe that that's the best practice and that's how things should be done. I could create my own sort of ecosystem of recipes that is readily available to install on every site that I spin out.
We were looking at a lot when we would have clients in specific verticals, and we would do sites for them that were very similar to each other, because it would give you a good starting point, even if you changed it afterwards, like just having that place to start from.
Yeah, exactly.
So, maybe a silly question, but one along the lines of something you shouldn't do, but people will probably do. Which gets run first, the config file imports or the config in the YAML in the recipe file?
Given what we saw happen here, I'm gonna say the config in the big YAML files in the config directory.
Like what Greg just mentioned, if you have a bunch you want to do, but maybe you only want to change a little bit, maybe you keep the YAML file and then you specify the.
Yeah. Technically speaking, it should be able to import it. I think the issue we're running into right now is that the config that's stored in this YAML file doesn't match exactly what's stored in the database. Maybe the keys are in a different order, and that's why we're seeing the failure here.
Can I ask about, I want to make sure I understand, with a module and you have the config folder, when you install that module, those YAML files, that's all that it needs to install those. My first thought was that when you have a recipe, you're putting your YAML files in there so that the YAML script file can reference them. Is that correct? Or do those config files get automatically applied when you
From my understanding, they get automatically applied.
So you don't have to put it there and also tell it to
because in the recipe YAML file that I have here, I'm not telling it anywhere, go and install this article content type. It's just picking it up.
It's like your sync directories.
Okay, in the module. Okay. I misunderstood that. Yeah, okay, cool.
The thing to remember is that certain config that may be shipping with modules will not be getting installed unless you explicitly call it out in the config import key.
Shipping with a module that's a dependency of your recipe. Okay.
So anything that's a configuration entity will not be imported by default. You have to explicitly tell it
in the
import this. Yeah.
Okay.
Or do something here and to tell it import all of the configuration from this module, for example. So if you know you will want to use the default editorial workflow that content moderation ships with, you could put content moderation start here, and it would install everything. But out of the box, by default will only install simple configuration.
Okay.